Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar in our GPAC series of Improving Practice webinars. We are really excited with our guest speaker this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you are, Professor Joshua Weiss, the co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard. This is a great honor for us. And also welcome to all of you. I see there are lots of participants. Thank you all for joining us. I know how many Zoom meetings there are and that there's a lot of competition. We are sure you won't be disappointed in choosing this one. I would first of all like to introduce you to GPAC, which is a global network of civil society organizations working on conflict prevention and peace building across the world, with the world divided into different regions which stay connected. And I'm sorry, my video wasn't on. Sorry, here now I can, hello? Maybe we can move to the next slide. We promote a global shift in peace building, in how armed conflict is dealt with, a shift from reaction to prevention with a lot of focus on human security. Here is a map of the world, and GPAC has 15 different regions that it works with, all of which are built up of different civil society organizations, active in both conflict prevention and peace building, and working in contact with each other in cross-regional approaches, particularly through working groups, such as this working group, the Improving Practice Working Group, which works on preparing toolkits, on trainings, and is particularly based on the principles of both human security, that is a people-based approach to security rather than military, and on a multi-stakeholder, inclusive approach. We have been doing webinars now for the last 3 years, rather longer than most people have been doing them on Zoom, but today is a very special day for us. Here's just a quick photograph of our group. I'm there somewhere, and my name is Lucy. I'm based in East Jerusalem. And now I will hand you over to Selma Youssef, who is the very active member of our working group, who is an attorney in Sri Lanka, and who has been kind enough and energetic enough to bring us our distinguished guest today. She will introduce Professor Josh and the rest of the subject and the events in the webinar. Thank you, Selma. Great to see you.
Thank you, Lucy. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone tuning in from all around the world. We have participants from all corners of the globe today, and it's very exciting to see the large turnout despite the competition, as Lucy mentioned, and the Zoom fatigue that's taking place. We believe that hopefully it's the testimony to the importance of the topic being discussed today and our distinguished speaker, who is here today to share insights from his latest publication, which So the game plan for today is that I will be introducing the speaker, and then I will be introducing the topic for the day, and then hand it over to our speaker, who will make his presentation, and thereafter we will have an interactive discussion, a lively Q&A. Important to mention to all present here today is that also we have a giveaway where our speaker is giving away a free audiobook of his latest publication to the person who asks the most interesting question. So please stay till the end. To start off on the title for today's webinar, it is what the world's highest stakes negotiations can teach peace practitioners. What is the best way to learn to negotiate more effectively? Most would say a combination of education, doing and learning best practices from one another. The webinar today will provide two of these three components by sharing a series of real-world negotiation cases. The cases are drawn from a vast array of negotiations, but all have something in common: learning from best practices from others and the ability to learn valuable lessons. In this webinar, our speaker will share insights from the world's highest stakes negotiations featured in his recently launched publication to inspire all aspects of peace work and practice, be it peace mediation, peace negotiation, and peace building. Hope you have a pen and paper ready, because there's going to be lots of learning and lots of tools that our speaker is going to share with you today. Our speaker today is Dr. Joshua Weiss. He is the co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard University and senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project. It's my pleasure and privilege to invite Dr. Joshua Weiss to take the floor. Josh, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Selma. It's really a pleasure to talk to everybody today. Can you all hear me okay? I've been having a little bit of a problem with my internet connection. Is it okay, or is it?
Yes, it is perfect.
Okay, great. Well, do let me know in the chat box if for some reason it's not, and I'll shut off my camera. That usually tends to help. So let me just begin by thanking you all for having me. I really appreciate it. It's quite an honor to be with you and to share a few insights into some work that I've been doing as of late in a book that just came out recently called The Book of Real World Negotiations. And in that book, I really tried to use case studies to help us all learn what is the, what are some of the best practices when it comes to negotiation. And let me tell you why, just before I get into some of the cases and examples, let me just share a little bit about why I thought this would be helpful. So when I first started working at Harvard many years ago, back in 1996, I had the privilege, because it really was a privilege of going to sort of these faculty dinners and having conversations with some of the best negotiators in the world and listening to their stories and their examples of negotiations that they had been involved in or where they were consulting and advising. And it was fascinating. I was really taken. And in fact, I think the reason that I continued in this field was very much due to those experiences. And I learned a tremendous amount from those stories of those real world negotiations. But one of the things that I noticed was that when we look around at the literature, there's not a lot of these cases that are out there for us to learn from. And so I had always thought in the back of my mind, if I had the opportunity to write a book, I would really like to write one about real world negotiations and these case studies so that people can learn from what actually happened in these situations. And more importantly, I think can learn from stories, because I've become, and I know most of you working in the peace field understand the value of stories. I don't know if everybody does. And for me, I also believe there are a lot of popular misconceptions about negotiation, conflict resolution, etc. And instead of talking to people about why I think those things might be a little bit off, I decided instead that I'd prefer to just show people by sharing these cases of real world negotiations and all the lessons that exist within. And so that took me on a bit of a journey to find these cases. Some of them are mine, some of them are my colleagues, and I was very grateful to them for sharing. But what you'll see, and I hope that you'll understand, that I'm going to share with you a few cases from the business world. I'm also going to share a few cases from peace processes and hostage negotiations. And I really want you to sort of keep an open mind to the lessons that come through in these cases, because you might think, what does a business case have to teach me about peacemaking? And I think that you'll probably be surprised when you hear some of these and what are some of the lessons that apply to you. And I've already had a number of people email me and say that they got the book and they either work internationally in the kind of work you do, or they work in the business world and they see applicability across these cases. And so that's actually why I included a lot of different cases from different realms, was to really to show people that negotiation cuts across all of these different places. And there are lessons to be learned for us all in the work that we have to do. We just have to think a little differently and a little creatively about what that looks like. So I'm going to share a handful of cases with you. I was going to share 3 business cases, but I think I might just start by sharing one, and then I'm going to move into talking about a hostage negotiation case in Afghanistan, an anecdote from peace process in Colombia, and then a crisis negotiation. And we'll see how much time we have. Honestly, I would like to leave more time for conversation and questions and answers. So let me get started and sharing all of this with you. So the first example is, and the title of the chapter is called Negotiating Effectively in the Face of a Significant Power Imbalance. And I think we all, no matter what work you do, come up against this, where you have to think about when power is not something that you possess and the other side does, what do you do about it? How do you try to manage it? And this particular case, I found to be incredibly insightful in terms of what do you do when you have a bad BATNA? Now, my assumption is folks are familiar with this terminology, but for those of you who are not, I'll just mention very briefly that your BATNA is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And that simply means that if you can't reach agreement in your negotiation, what will you do then? If you had to walk away from a particular negotiation, what are you walking away to? So the story in this case is about a company called Interagri, who was based in China, and they work on agricultural business products. And they actually needed to purchase some specialized machinery. Now, the machinery was quite expensive, and because they were based in China and some of the different rules that exist in China, they were not allowed to import this machine that cost many millions of dollars. So they had to engage with a company called Solantar, and Solantar was the only company in all of China that made this equipment. So folks, I don't know if you could just make sure that your line is muted in a little background, that would be great. So in this sole supplier situation where there was only one company that produced this, there were a lot of restrictions involved. And for Interagri, it was only possible to, excuse me for one sec. So folks, can you just check on your whether you're muted or not? Okay, thank you. In this sole supplier situation, Interagri went to Solantar and said that they needed to purchase some new equipment from them. They had bought the equipment in the past. And like I said, this was a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment that they needed to run their business. When they met with Solantar decided that they knew that they had a monopoly, and they decided that they would they were going to increase the price tenfold, 10 times the amount that had happened the last time they purchased it. And Interagri simply could not afford that. And so they were kind of at a loss as to what to do. So they called a colleague of mine and said, we need your help. We need to think about how can we negotiate something in these circumstances. So my friend went, talked and met with them and listened to them. And he said, well, we've got to work on your BATNA. And they said, well, that's the problem. We don't have a BATNA. If we walk away from this, we don't have any way to purchase this machinery. We can't import it, etc. And he said, I understand. However, I still want you to think about how to improve your BATNA because it's the key to this negotiation. And he said, I want you to imagine, he gave them this challenge. I want you to imagine that Solantar has gone out of business. And I want you to think, how are you going to still try to meet your need for this equipment? And they thought to themselves, this is ridiculous. We already have enough problems. Why is this person telling us, to imagine this scenario that's going to make it even harder? And he said, I'll be back in 3 days. And he left. And at first, the Interagri team was kind of stunned. They didn't know what to do with this situation. But then they started to get to work and they started to brainstorm some ideas. And at first they thought, could they refurbish this machinery? And a few other ideas that didn't really get them very far. They decided refurbishing the machinery was simply not going to be possible, etc. So they started to think differently. And one of the employees involved in the process said, I wonder if there's a company within China that's already purchased this machinery and might be interested in selling it to us. Maybe they aren't using it anymore. And the rest of the team, of course, didn't know. So they said, well, why don't you go investigate it and see what you can find? And after a good bit of exploration, this gentleman found that there was a company in Mongolia that had purchased the equipment. So they approached this company and they said, would you be willing to sell this equipment? It turned out that it was 2 years old and this equipment was useful for about 10 years. And the company said, actually, we've changed our business, so we would be interested in selling it. And so they took that information back and they went back to meet with Solantar and they said, look, we'd really like to purchase the equipment from you, but as we've told you before, it's simply too expensive. And if you're not willing to, come down in your price and change things, we do have an alternative, which is that we can purchase it from this other company. So when that happened, of course, Solantar said, well, we don't believe you. Tell us the company, et cetera. So they did, and they looked into it. And in fact, this other company was willing to sell the equipment. And so they negotiated differently. They had to negotiate in a more reasonable way. And so I think what this ends up, and ultimately in the end, Interagri and Solantar reached a deal that enabled them to stay in business and was much better for Interagri and still met the needs of Solantar. So when you look at a case like this, you think to yourself, and when I talk to people about sort of sole supplier situations or monopolies or, a conflict where you are faced with significant power imbalances, what do you do? And I think that what this case highlights is that you really have to think differently about your BATNA and how can you try to improve your BATNA in different ways to enable you to think that something is possible. One of the things that I see when I work with lots of different groups is when they are faced with power, they tend to throw their hands up and think there's just nothing they can do. And that's not the case. And I think what you see here is an example of how challenging assumptions and being creative enabled Interagri to actually reach some kind of an agreement that was more reasonable from their point of view. So for me, again, when you're confronted with a challenge like this, there are a number of lessons that I think are worth taking away. And like I said, even in bigger societal conflicts, it's important to view power as not an absolute, but actually as something that is rooted in different sources. And you've got to think, how can I begin to think about where my power lies in this situation, or where does power lie for the weaker side so that they can level the playing field a little bit and have a more productive negotiation in the end. And I think that from my point of view, there are a few lessons from this case that are valuable to think about. And of course, the first one is preparation. I'm a really big believer that if you think about a negotiation problem and really work the problem, there are a lot of solutions that can be found. And so, but preparation is really the key. And I find that people don't prepare nearly enough. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is really thinking through your BATNA carefully, especially when you have a bad one. And I think there are often ways to improve your BATNA if you take the time to explore them. But that also links to the next lesson, which is that we often make assumptions in negotiation about what's possible. And I'm a firm believer that you have to challenge those assumptions very clearly and check them by really exploring them in detail. And I think that was the role of the consultant here, um, where he pushed them to think differently and to say, well, wait a minute, are you sure that those assumptions are right and there's absolutely nothing you can do? And I think for all of you working in difficult conflicts and challenges, I think you bring a perspective um, that is coming in from the outside. I know in the conflicts that I've worked in, um, one of the first thing that goes is hope for a solution and the assumptions that nothing is possible. And yet, when I think when probably the biggest value that outsiders can bring to a conflict is to try to challenge that a little bit and to help um, parties to a conflict to see the possibilities as opposed to seeing the roadblocks. So I think that that's an important notion here um, in terms of your role and how you work in these conflicts. But I think these lessons to me are very transferable to the broader conflict realm, and I think are really important because, like I said, for me the notion of power is usually a debilitating one. It's one where we when we see it and we're up against it, we often think there's nothing we can do. And I would encourage you, like in this case, to sort of check your assumptions and really start to think differently. So let me, like I said, I prefer to jump ahead to a few cases that I think fit into your world. And if we have time, I'll come back to the other business cases. But like I said, but I also would really like to leave some time. I can see there's already a question or two about this. And we can come back to the cases and talk about them individually if you like, and the questions related to them. But I want to leave some time for scenarios that I think fit best into your world. So this is this example. The next case that I want to share with you is one that I think is fascinating and actually comes from a friend of mine that I went to graduate school with. And so the story is that my colleague Karen and her team were from UNHCR, and they were their job was basically to work in the western province of Herat in Afghanistan. This was back in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. And part of what she was doing was doing trainings in human rights in the local communities so that people understood what that looked like. And one day they were in a small village doing their training near the foreign ministry, one of the foreign ministry regional outlets. And as they were having lunch, somebody slipped her a note that essentially said that some women were being held in a village nearby against their will and needed help. And of course, my friend Karen and her team began to investigate and ultimately found the story to be true, that there were actually 22 Iranian girls and women who were being held as sex slaves. And Karen's remit in this instance was, of course, to work on any human rights issues that might exist in in Afghanistan, a big task, but certainly in the province that she was covering. So they started to think, how do we approach this problem, and how do we try to get these women and girls freed while not alienating the foreign ministry? Because there's of course, in this instance, there would be a a challenge related to face saving, right? that in Afghani culture, like other cultures in particular, face saving is a core element to what happens in a negotiation. So Karen and her team thought quite a bit about what do we do? How do we try to tackle this problem? And ultimately, they decided that they really needed to send a formal letter to the foreign ministry about the situation. And initially, it was this letter was met with denial. And Karen, being the persistent person that she is, realized that she needed to take a particular approach to this negotiation. And as she told me, in human rights work, as many of you are involved, a lot of the times it's about advocacy. It's about highlighting the problem and shining a light on it so that attention will come to it. But as Karen realized, if she did that, there would really be no opportunity to negotiate the release of these women because she would cause a loss of face to these folks. So what she ultimately did was took more of a problem solving approach. She said, we're going to have to work with the foreign ministry here. We don't know what the role of the foreign ministry is in this situation, but we're going to have to work with them to figure out what's going on. And she initially asked the foreign ministry for access to these women. They were being held in a remote village, in a bit of a sort of fortress, if you will. And they started by saying they just wanted to talk to these women and make sure that they were safe and secure. So the foreign ministry saw that and they said, okay, well, you can go and speak with them. That's okay with us. And that was the opening that Karen needed. And so Karen and her translator went and over the course of 6 months met with these women numerous times and ultimately said to the government, look, you've got a problem here. It's our job to help these women be released. And we're happy to try to do that in conjunction with you as opposed to, another approach that might perhaps make you look bad. And again, it was very unclear what their role was, but it seemed as if some people in the foreign ministry were somewhat involved here. But like I said, it was a little bit unclear. So they worked very hard to get the release of these women. And as part of that release, they could not simply have these women go free because women going around that part of Afghanistan might very well be killed because they weren't with men. So they had to either have them go back to Iran or find a home, a shelter for them. And in the end, they were able to get the release of 20 of the 22 women. Unfortunately, along the way, 2 of the women did end up committing suicide because of the stress and the strain of their situation, which of course broke Karen's heart. But, for her, this was something that had to get addressed. And so, she couldn't leave it. She couldn't decide not to do anything about it. And so in the end, she did get these women freed. And what she said to me in terms of the keys for this particular negotiation were really, again, sort of this notion of understanding the importance of face saving and why it was so critical to make sure that those that were on the other side of this and had the ability to release these women were able to not lose face. And she also explained that taking a problem solving approach to this situation was the only way to success. Had they taken more of an advocacy approach, she very well would not have gotten very far. I think also a really important lesson here is that sometimes when we go into a negotiation, we think of having a concrete plan. And my experience and the things that I've learned over the years is that it's better to have a contingency plan. In other words, you've thought of 3 or 4 different ways that you might take a certain negotiation. Because having one plan with one way of doing things can certainly lead to a deadlock. And then, folks often think that they're confused and not sure what to do. But if you've thought of 3 or 4 different avenues to try, then you have a number of different ways to go down that still will work for you. And so I think it's really important when you're planning to think in a contingency kind of way of what are the different ways that this negotiation might unfold and still get us to the same end. And I think you saw with Karen that she started down a more formal route and ultimately decided that there was, you know, another way to go about this that required relationship building, trust, and sort of showing up again and again, and letting the foreign ministry know that they weren't going anywhere until the situation was resolved. But also for the women, for the Iranian women who were being held hostage, it was obviously a very traumatic experience for them. And so Karen and her team had to also win their trust and get them to understand that in the end that they were doing something that would ultimately help them. And in this negotiation, there were also a number of negotiations happening at once. There was at first the negotiation with the person who gave them the note, and was this really a real scenario, or was this fabricated in some way, shape, or form? Then the negotiations with the foreign ministry, then the negotiations with the women, etc. So there were multiple negotiations, and Karen and her team had to sequence these properly in a way that enabled them to get the release of these women. So I think that for me, there are a tremendous amount of lessons when it comes to this case related to these kinds of situations. I think there are a lot of people that might question whether this scenario should have been negotiated. But when I spoke to Karen about that, she said, we thought long and hard about whether we could take an advocacy route, but given the remote nature of the province and perhaps the lack of attention that they thought they could generate toward it, they thought negotiating in this problem-solving way was the best way to get there. And 20 women are alive and well as a result of this effort. So I think that, I think their assumption about the way to go about this problem was the right one from my point of view. And again, I know we'll come back to all of this when we get into our questions, and I'll loop back. Like I said, I see there are some questions, and we can loop back to those after I've talked about some of these other cases. So the next case that I want to share with you comes from my colleague, William Yuris, who I know many of you know. So William has been involved in a lot of different peace processes over the years. And the latest one was one in Colombia that he had helped to serve as an advisor to President Santos. And the title of this chapter is The Difference Between Stalemate and a Solution, and a different word. And so as William was working with President Santos, about a few months into the process, a situation arose that was very significant. So the problem was that as they were negotiating the different aspects of the peace agreement, they came to the issue and the problem of transitional justice and how to deal with past acts and crimes that had been committed. And there was a former general who was part of the negotiating team for the government, and he felt that, and based on his knowledge of other peace agreements in other places, Guatemala, and South Africa, etc., that the military had been singled out or was going to be singled out and bear the brunt of the decisions that were taken by them, but also by other government officials, and that, generally speaking, he realized that it's fairly typical that the military be the ones that suffer the consequences of these actions, and not more broadly everybody who had been involved. And so the general decided that he really was not okay with that as part of any agreement, and it was really important that the state, as you'll come to see, be held accountable, and not just the military who was acting on orders of the state. So the general felt so strongly about this, and in the proposed agreement, the military would be the ones that were going to face justice in a disproportionate manner, again, as he saw. And so he felt so strongly about this that he essentially went public and said that if this was going to be the solution, then he was going to withdraw from the process. And this then turned into a crisis because the general was a very well-respected person. And if he was going to pull back from the negotiation very likely would have ended. And that might very well have been the end of the process. So there was an emergency meeting with William. They called him and said, "This is what we know. And could you come down and help?" And so when William came down, he realized quickly that they were engaged in a very positional negotiation. There was a lot of back and forth around the language and what the proper language was. But what William realized was that the parties had not really probed what that language meant, and what it meant to the different people involved. So William called the parties together and began to unpack this issue. And what the issue really was that in the agreement, the language that was being used was where they referred to institutional actors, which was code for the military, according to this general. And so they began to say, well, if that language is not okay, and if the sentiment here is that not only will the military be, held accountable, but so will other people who were involved at that, throughout the process. So what other words could we use that would be helpful and more accurately reflect the situation? So they brainstormed for a bit and they said, well, what about just using the terminology of the word state as opposed to institutional actors? And the general thought about it for a little bit, and he finally said, that meets my need of realizing that, yes, the military was part of this. We certainly have to be accountable for what we've done, but that also includes government officials and others that should also be part of that process. And so by switching the terminology from institutional actors to the word state, they were able to unstick the process and move things forward. And I think what ends up happening here is that you can see you've got some very bright people involved in this process, but they got stuck in a very positional negotiation around language. And this happens a lot. And the problem is that sometimes we don't think to say, well, what do we mean by that word? What's that word, the connotation or the meaning behind that word? And is there different language that we can use to help us, right? So I think for me, some of the really important lessons in this case in particular is that it's very easy for us to get locked into positions and just stay at the level of, well, I want you to do that and I don't want to do that, and to go back and forth, which is really what happened and created a crisis in this situation. And when you get down to it, language certainly matters a tremendous amount when we are crafting agreements, et cetera. And you got to be very careful of the words you choose. And not only that, but the meaning that exists there. Because in this instance, for the general, institutional actors clearly meant the military. And he felt in many ways that that was unfair. And so the other piece is digging down to understand the underlying meaning of these words when you're stuck. So as opposed to trying to think of an entirely new way to do something, which wasn't necessary in this case, what was necessary is saying, what does institutional actors mean? And if it means that, particularly the military, then is there another word that we could use that would better reflect this, that's agreeable to everybody? And it was that twist that ended up enabling people to realize that there was a word that was acceptable to everybody. The other lesson I think that's important in this case, from my point of view, is to be careful of the challenges of transference. So, transference is really the idea of bringing one lesson from a conflict to another, or from one negotiation to another. And while I think those lessons certainly are applicable, you do have to be careful when you're doing that to make sure that you are comparing sort of apples to apples and not apples to oranges or different things altogether. Um, and so I think in this case, it was a simple word. It was thinking differently and creatively about what does that word really mean to the different people involved, and is there another word that we might use that would be acceptable? And so you wouldn't think that a peace process would hinge on a single word, but in this case, it really did. So let me go ahead and share with you one more case, and I'd love to be able to stop there, I think, and open it up for more of a conversation. Like I said, I see some questions already here. So this case is called "Listening Them Down from a Tree," and in addition to the Afghani case that I mentioned, this is one of my favorite because I think the lessons are really tremendous for all of us. So the story is a bit of a tragic one, but essentially, there were two people involved in this story. Their names were Arthur and Mary. And Arthur and Mary were married, and they were living in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Now, Arthur and Mary were in their 30s, and they were methamphetamine addicts. They were also Native Canadians, and that's important to the story, as you'll see. Now, Mary and Arthur had been together for quite a while. This habit had of being a methamphetamine addict had fed into their life and was a real key part of their relationship. But one day, Mary woke up and decided that she had enough of this, and that she really felt like they were going to die if they didn't change their lifestyle. Um, and she pleaded with Arthur to go to a rehabilitation clinic, but he simply refused. He liked their life. He had no problem with it, and he was not in the same space as Mary. So Mary tried very hard the rest of that day to get him to come, but he simply wouldn't, and she was not going to continue along, despite the fact that she loved Arthur. She just had to clean her life. So she left and checked herself into this rehabilitation clinic on the outskirts of Calgary. Arthur was devastated, and he really needed to show Mary how, in his mind, how she had ruined his life. So he decided that um, he was. Let me just take a quick step back and say, when Mary checked herself into the clinic, she had called Arthur and said that she had a beautiful room and that she really wanted him to join her there. And there was a magnificent tree outside of her window. And that was one of the keys for Arthur. So he decided that the way that he was going to teach Mary a lesson was that he was going to hang himself in the tree and show her what she had done to his life. So he proceeded to the garage and got the rope, and drove to the clinic. And it was coming upon early evening in Calgary. This was late October. And so Arthur climbed up the tree and started to tie the noose around the tree, etc. Meanwhile, a young man happened by and noticed what was happening. He called out to Arthur and said, "Is everything okay?" And Arthur yelled back, "Mind your own business." So the young man knew things were not okay, and he quickly called 911 to get to the police. And when they got to the police, the dispatcher ended up calling Gary, who is the crisis negotiator. So the dispatcher explained to Gary what was going on as he drove to the scene. And when he got to the scene, he went over to the tree and he began by saying, had some initial chit chat where Arthur was very standoffish. And then Gary simply asked him, "Friend, what's it going to take to get you out of this tree?" And Arthur's reply was, "I'm only coming out of this tree in a body bag after I've killed myself." Now, Gary persisted, as most crisis negotiators would, and continued to try to have a dialogue. He could see that Arthur was increasingly getting frustrated. So Gary tried again and said, "Friend, there's got to be some way that I can get you to come out of this tree alive." Finally, Arthur said, I'll tell you what, if you can guess my native Canadian name, I'll come out of the tree. So Gary asked him to sort of be able to try to think about this a little bit. And so he went back to his car and he called the dispatcher and he asked the dispatcher to call Mary, knowing what had transpired there, and ask her for Arthur's native Canadian name. So the dispatcher hung up, called Mary, and Gary was very clear to say, don't tell Mary why we're asking, just get his native Canadian name, because she would probably come over to the tree and who knows what Arthur would do. So the dispatcher called back and explained to Gary that Arthur's native Canadian name was Running Buffalo. So Gary went back to the tree and he said, so I think that your name is Running Buffalo. And the minute he said Running Buffalo, Arthur came scurrying down the tree as fast as possible. As I mentioned, it was late October in Calgary, so it was getting cold. And when they were in the ambulance, Gary said to Arthur, I need to ask you, what was behind the idea of me figuring out your native Canadian name? And he said, well, I really wanted to come out of the tree, but I really didn't know how to do it without losing face. And so when you guessed my name, we were ultimately on even footing and I could come down. Now, there's a lot of interesting lessons from this case in my mind. And I think in many ways, one that is really clear is that one of the keys to success for crisis negotiation, hostage negotiation, or these kinds of situations is building rapport between the officer and the person in crisis. And as Gary often said to me during the process of this, writing up the case study, he said, a lot of times when we get onto the scene of a hostage or a crisis negotiation, people are expecting Arnold Schwarzenegger, and we come across as Mr. Rogers. In other words, we understand that we have to connect with them and get them on some level to trust us. Otherwise, we're never going to get them to come out or come down or to acquiesce. So that building of rapport is so fundamental to being able to to get to what's really happening in a given situation. And I know you all realize that in your negotiations, when you're working with parties in deeply divided societies, rapport is critical, and getting to those underlying interests is also critical. And I think one of the things that I learned in doing this book is no matter what the context and what the situation, the psychological aspects play a significant role in almost any negotiation. I've seen a lot of business negotiations and a lot of nonprofit negotiations fall by the wayside because of a psychological or an intangible issue that was really driving behavior. And we don't always think there to go there. We tend to look more at the tangible things and not focus enough attention on some of those. So, for Arthur, it was this ability to save face that was so essential to this kind of scenario. And also, Gary recognized that Arthur was in some kind of a psychological trap. And in this case, Arthur had entrapped himself. He had made it difficult for himself to come out of the tree because he defined that in terms of winning and losing. And the other thing that Gary mentioned to me was that when you're dealing with folks like this, the last thing you want to do is advocate to them or tell them all the things that they've done wrong. Rather, the idea is to focus more on inquiry and asking questions that get them to talk to you so that they will ultimately decide to come out or give themselves up, etc. So I think that in my mind, this certainly highlights a number of notions that I think we're all familiar with: the idea of building rapport, the idea of helping the other side save face. And in fact, I just recently wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review about the importance of saving face and face preservation and face saving in most negotiations, and to really be thinking there when you're involved in a difficult negotiation. So I see we've got a number of questions here, and I think maybe best to pause and have a bit of a conversation, if that's okay with everybody.
Thank you so much. Amazing, wonderful stories, apart from anything else, just riveting to listen to you. Thank you so much. And so much that actually goes across in terms of the relationship building, the face saving, and the need for thinking. Really important. Thank you so much. I don't want to take time from people with questions. So I think if that's okay with you, let's start. And I think just take them in order. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. Yep.
I mean, it seems as good a way as any to do things fairly. Let's
Sure.
start. We have from Elif, who asks, to what extent can we share the details of our BATNA?
So it's a good question, Alif. Very important. And it's always really important to think about, should you share your BATNA or not in a given situation? Does it help you? Does it hurt you? And how do you share your BATNA? You know, there are a lot of people, when it comes to negotiation, there are a lot of people who like to try to hit the other person over the head with their BATNA, use it as a threat. And I'm not a fan of that. I don't believe that that's the way that you should be doing this. And in the Interagri case, they really didn't do that. They simply said, look, you know, we cannot purchase the equipment at the price that you're asking. And just so you know, and when they came back around, they said, you know, we do have an alternative. Our preference would be to work with you to find some way forward, but there is something we can do. And so I believe the best thing to do when it comes to BATNA is to think about, should I share it? And if so, how can I share it, you know, as sort of a natural consequence, just letting them know that you're not beholden to them in this negotiation. There is something else that you can do, is the way that I typically will share a BATNA. But even, you know, it's interesting because, you know, in Getting to Yes, when they talk about BATNA, they talk about BATNA as really about confidence for you more so than hitting the other over the head with it, for example. And that means that you negotiate differently when you have a BATNA or a good BATNA. And so I think in this case with Interagri, when they first sat down with Solantar, they really negotiated in a manner where they just kind of said, well, what are you, you know, asking for this equipment? And, you know, when Solantar told them, they, you know, for them, they looked at it and said, well, there's nothing we can do here. But when they had a BATNA, they went back to Solantar and they negotiated differently. They negotiated with more confidence because they actually understood that there was something that they could do other than having to pay an exorbitant price for something. So I think, you know, BATNA is as much about a confidence builder for you as a negotiator and having a good one as it is about the situation in general. And so, like I said, I think the way that they shared it was the way that I would do it. They said, you know, our preference, and this is usually what I say, which is my preference is to try to see if I can find a solution with you. But I just want you to understand that if we can't, then, you know, there is something that I can do and we may have to exercise that alternative. But to emphasize that you really do want to work with them if that's the case. So that's how I would do it. And I do think it's important to think carefully about how you share your BATNA. It is a choice, and it can perhaps, you know, create some animosity between you and the other if you don't share it well.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting and helpful answer. Thank you. Now there is a question from Gay Rosenblum Kumar, but she's not here. She said she can't stay online for the whole meeting, but she hopes to watch the recording. So she asks, when you are supporting the significantly lower power stakeholder, how do you advise or encourage them to seek principled, non-violent strategies in a BATNA, or otherwise over other strategies that may use violence or have more negative implications?
Sure. And that's a difficult one. Of course, when you're dealing with people who have been involved in intractable conflicts and don't see much hope, the desire to use violence always rises to the surface because of the frustrations involved. I think what I usually do is I try to help people to stay focused on what their goals are. What are you really trying to achieve, and is violence going to get you there? And in the end, I also try to take people to the balcony, which is a concept that many of you probably know about. But the idea is to kind of step back and say, I understand as best I can as an outsider the frustrations you're having, but is this really going to get you to where you want to go? And what I find is if you give people enough time and you give them the opportunity to discuss, they'll realize that violence doesn't serve their interest and will only set them back. And that's the opportunity to talk about other ways of trying to get at. And as you all know, working in these difficult conflicts, there are always going to be factions that want to use violence. And there may not be a lot that you can do about that, but it's really the middle, it's the center that's so critical to keep working at nonviolent strategies and negotiation and things along those lines. So I think for me, the most persuasive things that I've used is really trying to, loop back to them and say, let's talk about what your goals are, what your interests are, and the best way to meet those. Because in the end, as you all know, some kind of negotiation is going to happen as part of this process. The question is when and where and how. And so I think if people can see how negotiation, for example, and their BATNA can really help them achieve their goals better than violence, that's going to be the best way to persuade them. It's not easy, of course, as you well know, but I think you can also, look back at the history and say, has this really gotten you where you want to be or not?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really helpful to focus on the goals, but like you say, there's a lot of frustration, and especially in imbalanced situations, and
yeah,
not so easy to convince people.
No.
Thank you. Here from John, he says, seems like a power analysis is key here in determining the role of the negotiator, who could be an insider-outsider, partial or impartial. To what extent does the negotiator determine and shape that role?
So let me see if I understand the question.
Maybe John should speak it to you, perhaps, if he expresses it. Maybe that would help.
Sure. John, are you there? Could you come on the line?
Yeah. Hi, Joshua.
Yeah.
Just thinking about, to what extent as a negotiator are you handed the role? And then what kind of power and like analysis of power to determine if you shift from insider to outsider, partial to impartial in the role as negotiator? Does that make sense?
Can you give me an example of what you're thinking?
Well, if you have been invited in as an outsider,
okay,
to what extent do you find yourself as a neutral party, even if you may have a preference for one side or the other?
Yeah.
In your talks, it seems like you're always an outsider, but there are insiders as well who are invited into some of these processes. And when you build relationships, when you build trust, when you build that rapport, do you actually slide into the insider role? And to what extent do you manage your own partiality, impartiality?
I got you. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm glad you used the word partiality, impartiality as opposed to neutral, because I'm not a fan of the idea of neutrality, because I don't think anybody's really neutral. We are either partial or impartial. I think it's very hard to be neutral, because immediately when you hear about a situation, your biases start to kick in. I think it depends on the role that you're coming in to a situation in. For me, a lot of times I'll come in as an advisor to people involved. And, so I'm giving advice to one side and maybe not the others, as opposed to, say, taking more of a mediating role. And so I guess in those cases, inherently partial, because I'm being brought in by one side to the other. But I will say that, I've been brought in to certain circumstances where I was actually being brought in by one side, but they were very clear that they wanted me to also help the other side because they felt like by doing that, we'd have the best chance of actually reaching some agreement, some way forward. Um, and in terms of power, I mean, it's a difficult one. I think, I try to see my job when I'm working with parties is to help them to break power down, especially the weaker party, and say, I know you think you don't have any ability to influence the situation, but I think if you were to break power down into its component parts, you might think about that differently. You might realize that there are actually things that you can do in this negotiation that you didn't think were possible. So does that answer your question, John?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. Now one from Flori. She
Mhm.
says, speaking of transference, what are key lessons learned regarding trying to transfer this negotiation technology into another culture? For example, my experience with the concept of BATNA resulted in loss of trust among parties. For some, coming to a negotiation with an alternative concrete option was negotiation in poor faith.
So it's a very interesting question, Flori. First of all, I think it's really critical in any negotiation that you go into that you have thought through your BATNA. And I think one of the questions I would ask you is, how was the BATNA deployed, if you will? How was it utilized? I can certainly see in some cultures how people might look at that situation and say that's bad faith. For me, the way that I view BATNA is that BATNA to me is all about how do you achieve your goal as best as possible. And I might take a slightly different view of negotiation than most folks. And what I mean by that is, to me, if you go through a negotiation, if I sit down with somebody and I'm trying to find a way forward in an agreement, and I realize at the end of the day that um, that there are better ways for me to meet my interest as best as possible than reaching agreement with this person or this particular way forward. Um, which means that I would exercise my BATNA. Like, I see that as success, because to me, negotiation is not about reaching agreement. It's about meeting your objectives as best as possible. And you want to always have those different things at your disposal. So, and in fact, if you think about it, if you've ever kind of gone through a negotiation process and reached an agreement with somebody and walked out of the room and felt disappointed or felt like I shouldn't have done that because I could have actually done better elsewhere, well, you're doing yourself a disservice. So I think in some way, part of it is how you set up the negotiation. It's the expectations you create. But I think it's also important that you're clear with people that, look, that they have goals and objectives that they're trying to meet, and you are as well. And if you can do that through reaching agreement together, that's great. But if you can't, that's okay as well. Negotiation in my mind is an exploration of the relationship. And can we find something that is really beneficial for both of us? And if it isn't, um, if I say yes, and I know I could have done better, I could have met my objective better through my BATNA, I can tell you what's going to happen, that I'm not going to implement the agreement well. I'm going to feel a little bit bitter about it all and things like that. I was just actually teaching a class yesterday and talking to one of my students who said that she compromised on something that was really important to her. And after the meeting, she felt sick to her stomach. And I said, that's exactly it, that you don't want to do that in negotiation, because negotiation is this exercise in meeting your goal. And so part of it may be that, you need to explain the approach that you're using. If you do sense that the other side may see BATNA in this way, and some of that's your preparation. If you understand that in that particular culture, folks are going in and they believe that it's really important to reach agreement, you might need to try to set some expectations, or at least see what kind of a conversation you can have related to this.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. My question was more in terms of transfer of technology in general, whether I just use the BATNA as one concept. But basically, going into different cultures with what we've developed in largely North America, although many lessons learned over the last, 4 decades now or more, 81 getting to the S. So I was just,
Right.
because of experience and just because there's such a wide audience here, I was curious what it might, but I'm not asking you to go any further than that. There are lots of questions. Thank you. Just something for all of us to think about.
Yeah, sorry, I missed it a little bit there, but I hear what you're saying and I understand. Yeah, that negotiation technology notion. Yeah, in another culture, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. And I think this point that you made about not needing agreement, that's something really important that I will take from this. Thank you. Let me move on. We have a lot of questions.
Okay.
From Gus, we have, I think, another 8 or 9 to go. So from Gus,
Okay.
is it ethical in a negotiation to get someone or a party you're negotiating with to agree to something that you want, with the party thinking or believing that it was his or her idea in the first place?
For me, the essence of negotiation is persuasion. It's the ability to persuade the other to go down certain roads. And I think that when you say that you want this person thinking or believing that it was his or her idea in the first place, I'm a big believer that you can't change people's minds. You can only change the conditions under which they change their own minds. And so I'm guessing you're probably referring to the scenario between Gary and Arthur. I don't know if I don't think it crosses any ethical lines. I mean, if you do, you're more than welcome to hop on and let me know. In the end, it was Arthur's decision to decide to create an opening or not. Arthur could have very easily have said, I'm not coming down out of this tree, and that's the end. But there was an element there that he wanted to, but he didn't know how to because of this psychological trap that he had been put in. So I think, I guess what I would say to your question is that in many ways, I think that if you present something to another person in a negotiation and they ultimately sort of adopt it and see the idea as their own, or see the solution that ultimately comes out of a negotiation as something they had a hand in creating, which is one of the real keys to negotiation and having negotiation, a solution actually stick and last through the implementation, then I think that's part of the process of getting people to kind of buy in and realize, yeah, that does meet my interests. Sometimes in negotiation, people aren't necessarily thinking of an alternative idea that meets their interest. And so, for example, if you hold up another way that somebody might be able to meet their goals that they hadn't considered, they might very well say, yeah, well, I'd like to do that. And, had I thought about it, maybe I would have come up with that on my own, something along those lines. But I think so. I think it's ethical. because you're not coercing anybody. You're putting in front of them a story, a narrative, a set of facts, a set of ideas, and they're coming to that conclusion on their own. Um, I guess you can ask the question, are you manipulating them? I don't think so. In this case, I think there is a lot of possibility for manipulation and negotiation, but I think in this particular case with Gary and Arthur, I don't think that was the case.
Thank you very much. Now there's a question here from Philip Williams. If you conduct a debrief after a negotiation, where is the greatest value in building our negotiation skills? Is it best to focus your effort on negotiations that went well, or should you focus on those that went badly?
Very good question, Philip. I think honestly, my belief is that you can learn from both. I think it's really important when things do go well to say, well, what did I do effectively here? It's easy. I think sometimes we are our harshest critics, so it's easy to sort of beat ourselves up when things don't go well. And there are a lot of lessons. I do think it's really important that when you go through a negotiation and it doesn't end the way you imagined it would, that it's really important to ask those questions and say, what could I have done differently? But it's a little bit like when I am teaching my students or folks in a company, I'll say, it's really important for you to take a little time to think about your strengths and how do you build on those as a negotiator, as well as your weaknesses. Just thinking about weaknesses sometimes can be debilitating and not as helpful. You've got to also recognize, hey, I do these things well, and those are the foundation of my approach to negotiation. So I would say after every negotiation, you should do sort of a post-mortem, as we call it, of looking back and saying, what happened here? And, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody a couple months ago, and they said, wow, I really learned a lot from that negotiation. And I said, oh, what did you learn? And they kind of stopped and realized that they hadn't really processed what they'd learned. And so I said, well, let's talk about what you really learned from that negotiation. And when we did, we started breaking it down in a way. And so to me, experience is a great teacher if you really let it, and if you really take the time to analyze what happened, as opposed to just going through the motions and thinking that you learned something. So I would encourage you after every negotiation to say, how did that go? What did I learn? What was I surprised by? We kind of use, one of my colleagues at Harvard, a guy named Mike Wheeler, is a great guy, uses the notion of the 80-20 rule, that basically when you go into a negotiation, there's about 80% that you can know, you can understand, and you can prepare for. And then there's 20% you can't, that, we're working with incomplete information. We have to do all these different kinds of things. And so we have to have a bit of an agile mindset and be adaptable in our approach to negotiation. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to say, could I have seen some of these things coming, or were these the kind of things that I need to get more comfortable being adaptable and adjusting to a situation as it comes? So for me, that's best practice. Best practice is after every negotiation to ask yourself those questions.
Thank you. That sounds really important. Again, the emphasis on thinking everything through. Thank you. The next question.
The other thing, just say, Lucy, I'll just say one other one. To me, to be an effective negotiator is not a destination. You don't really ever get there. It's a journey. It's a continual journey where you keep learning. I mean, like most of the folks on the call, I've been doing this a long time, and I still, make my mistakes. I have my problems. I realize after the fact I could have done something differently. And that, to me, that's why negotiation is a very humbling experience, a very humbling process. And I think if you have that mindset of, I'm going to keep learning how to get better and better, and yet I'm never going to get there, there's something very exhilarating about that, and also something humbling to say, that's right. Like I said, sometimes people will say, oh, negotiation expert. And it's like, well, I'm knowledgeable about this, but I don't know what being an expert in this means, because we all have these moments where we realize we could have done something different. And I think it's important. It's an important mindset to have, because then you're open to pulling in lessons from all of these different places and thinking about how they can contribute to your learning.
Thank you. That's real wisdom. Thank you. Very, very helpful. Are we okay still to go on for time for questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So from Danesto, who has quite a long question, says, good cases, enjoyed listening to them. I would like to lift off from Colombia's case of stalemates and solutions on a statewide scale. In the Philippines, armed conflict with non-state forces has been going on for a very long time. Have you encountered similar cases involving complex and historically grounded armed conflicts elsewhere? And if there are similar conflicts, what successful strategies were used to achieve solutions better than a hypothetical BATNA or SAFT? Then he goes on. Another similar question is, the Philippines has an agency, the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process, which facilitates peace processes between the government and armed violent extremists. I was just wondering if you have encountered similar government departments involving social healing and peace building elsewhere, and if you can share best practices. Thank you very much. I think that's a lot for you to answer.
So I haven't seen a lot of offices like that are established, and I know there are a number of different conflicts within the Philippines. And in fact, there is a case in the book on the Philippines that you can take a look at as well. Let me just go back to the early question there, where successful strategies were used to achieve solutions better than a hypothetical BATNA. I think, and there are probably folks on the call that might be better to answer than myself on this one. I mean, I think when you look back at lessons of conflicts in intractable situations and what approaches were utilized, I think that there are some important lessons there. I think if you look at South Africa, if you look at Northern Ireland, if you look at Mozambique, there are a lot of important lessons there that I think get to, I mean, for me in the end, I do think that the core of a lot of this is all about, is about those underlying human needs that haven't been met over many years. And how do you try to satisfy those so that, the conflict has a chance of transforming? And, I think to me, in the end, if this ultimately needs to get down to the party's interest and figuring out what those really are and having, willing participants. I mean, I think that's one of the big challenges in large scale societal conflicts is the political will to tackle these things. And I think when you look at the conflicts that are still out there that are still not solved, that's certainly a dynamic that's at play, is that the parties don't have the political will, or there's a power asymmetry that's preventing it from taking hold. So that's my perspective on it. I think that you also have to get to places where the parties see the situation as ripe or take actions to ripen the situation to get people to have a bit of an urgency to deal with it. And I think when there isn't that urgency, people can find ways to just drag things along. And that's again where I think a BATN analysis does become helpful for a party to say, look, how do we create the urgency to deal with this challenge as opposed to just continuing to limp along? And so when you do that BATN analysis, that helps you to say, well, what are the things that we can do to try to get the other side to the table? And obviously people can be desperate and that's when violence takes hold. But I think when you go through that BATN analysis, you can help parties to also think about what are the different things, whether it might be a nonviolent struggle or are there other coalitional partners that can be brought in. So I do think, I don't know, for me, I really think that when you're at a place where things aren't moving, you've got to do a very clear, succinct BATN analysis figure out how do you get things going and moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Yes, not easy. Next question is from Mark, who asks about sharing BATNA. What determining factors should you consider for you to share your BATNA? What situation should we be careful of on sharing it?
So I think when you're considering sharing your BATNA, I think you certainly want to. I think it's worth trying to empathize a bit and say, how is my BATNA going to come across to the other? Is it going to come across as a threat? And if so, how do I try to share that as a more of a natural consequence than a threat? My colleague who passed a number of years ago, Roger Fisher, used to say that a threat and a warning are very different. And he used to say that a threat is if you say to your son, or a warning if you say to your son, Johnny, if you go out in the street on your bike, you're going to get hit by a car. That's a warning. A threat is if you go out in the street on your bike, I'm going to hit you with my car. Right? It comes across very differently. And so I think what you want to do is really think about how can I share my BATNA as just a very matter of fact, this is something that I can do. And again, I try to couch it by saying it's not my preference. My preference is to try to find a way forward with you. And I think that helps. I've found when I use that language, it lets the other know that, okay, well, I guess they're not beholden to me in this negotiation, but they are still sharing with me that they are committed to this process and want to see if it makes sense. So I think empathizing and really thinking to yourself, how's this going to come across to the other side is one thing. And then I would also say that you want to think, what's the benefit of sharing my BATNA versus not sharing it? There's a lot of times when it's enough for you just to know what your BATNA is because it gives you the confidence to negotiate a little bit differently. So I would ask yourself, why would I share my BATNA in this case? Does it make sense for me to do that or not? So I think those are really the two considerations: is what's the benefit to sharing my BATNA, and being clear about that. And then on the flip side, how's this going to come across to the other, and how do I try to share this in a way that doesn't put them off, but just lets them know that this is part of the negotiating landscape that I'm thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There are various messages of thanks in the chat, particularly, first of all, from Elif, who you responded to. The next question is from Arjan, who says, thanks for the inspiring lessons and questions. My question to you is, how do you identify the assumptions if you believe they are facts, reality, and don't have the luxury of an external consultant? In other words, how do you avoid biases before and during negotiations?
So that's a great question, Arjun. One of the best ways that I know that you can avoid these things is to be conscious of them. I often say to folks that when you're aware of biases, when you're aware of tricks and tactics that people use in negotiation, they no longer have the same effect, right? If I know that I'm susceptible to something called the vividness bias, right? Which means that the more I focus on something, or the more clear something is and highlighted in negotiation, the more I'm going to be drawn to that. Or, if I'm susceptible to confirmation bias, which is, that we tend to look for information that confirms our views as opposed to contrary information. If I know those are biases that exist, I can remind myself, hey, be careful of this because I know this could sway my view. And I often say to folks that it's really important to kind of turn on your assumptions checker when you're negotiating and say, all right, so I think this is going on. Why do I think that? Do I think that because they've told me that, or because there's some part of the story related to this negotiation that's led me to make that assumption? So I think the most important thing that you can do is be aware of these concepts and ideas and how they play on you. You know, I direct a master's degree program at a university here, and we have an entire course on the psychology of leadership and negotiation, because I believe that half of your challenges, to be an effective leader or negotiator, half of your challenges are out there with the people that you deal with and the dynamics and things like that. But the other half are in you. And so we have a course like that to help people to realize that there are all these biases, there are all these psychological principles that are critical to know if you're going to negotiate effectively. So, you know, so the simple answer is know what all these biases are and keep them in mind. Be aware of them as you're going through the process, because they will, you know, have much less of an impact on you because you're aware of them and you're conscious of them and thinking that, you know, am I getting entrapped by my own behavior? That you only ask that question when you know what psychological entrapment is, right? So that would be my answer there.
Thank you very much indeed. Again, really, really helpful. There's a question, I'm not sure if it's a question about Libya, from Remera. She says, in Libya, there's many bodies who are leading the reconciliations between the tribes, but the results didn't match the achievements, which made people or the beneficiaries lose their trust. Do you think that's a question? I'm not sure.
I mean, I think it might be a bit of a question. There's a question embedded in there, I think, about, you know, about process, I would say, you know, that there was a reconciliation process, but perhaps, you know, the right people, the right parties weren't involved. It sort of suggests that. It seems to me that you know, as she said, as they say, you know, between the tribes, but the results didn't match the achievements. So there was something that was misaligned. And I think, you know, a lot of times we need to give as much thought to process as we do outcome. And I know the folks on this call know that because they work in this world. But I think the average person, when it comes to negotiation, doesn't often align those things, doesn't always say, do we have the right parties at the table? You know, and I think people's tendency is to leave difficult parties out of the situation, as opposed to bringing them in and realizing that. But when you do leave certain parties out that ought to be there, maybe you get the result that's being discussed here.
Thank you. We're a tiny bit over time. I'm sorry, I just noticed.
Okay.
Do you have time for 2 more questions, or would you prefer to wrap up?
Let's go with 2 more.
Okay, thank you. They were the ones that came through earlier.
Okay.
There's one that says, to what extent do you encourage parties to engage in negotiation skills training, ideally jointly, and pre-negotiation talks about talks before negotiations?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that, actually. I really believe that part of the real challenge is that people don't know there's another way to negotiate. And you know, I think that approach to negotiation, you know, say the more interest-based approach, helps people to realize that the only way that they're going to make any progress is to realize that they're in this together. There's an interconnected nature to all of this. Otherwise, people would just walk away, right? So I think the more skills people have, the more common language they have. So when somebody says, can you tell me what your interests really are, or what's really critical here, or your BATNA is, or, you know, using some of that language, I think when people have that, they also begin to build a bit of a connection around the fact that they do have similar skills, and understand each other, and can build some bonds that way. I mean, even just having that common language can help people to realize that maybe there are some commonalities to work off of. So I absolutely think it's a great idea if you can do it. And I've done some of that, for example, with General Motors and the United Auto Workers. You know, I did a session with them prior to a negotiation on interest-based negotiation, and it made a huge difference. You know, people took took it to heart and really moved away from a competitive approach and toward this more collaborative way of doing things.
Thank you. And then finally, from Sarah, she says, I'd love to ask a question about groups that aren't particularly interested in resolution, whose identities are so connected to the conflict, they're not ready to let it go.
Sure, and I think that there are a lot of groups that define themselves by the conflict, right? And in part, their identity is rooted in that. And I think in order to try to work with that, you've got to realize that's what's going on, and to think, how do we help them redefine their identity in a way that actually could embrace some kind of a solution. It's very challenging, but I think that's the only way that you can help those folks to make a shift, is by saying, how do we help them redefine who they are, so that they're not defining themselves by the conflict itself, but by something else, maybe something more positive that would take them into the future. That's kind of what comes to mind for me there. Not easy though.
But an amazing way to conclude this wonderful webinar. Thank you so very much. I, for one, will be buying your book, and I've learned already a huge amount during this hour and a half. Selma, did you have a few concluding words?
Yes, thank you, Lucy. And wow, thank you, George, for your insights, your presentation, and the very useful responses that you gave, which were on point and answering all the questions that came your way with very tangible techniques and tools which we could add to our toolbox. So just to sum up, I'm not going to sum up or touch on everything that was discussed, but just a few points that came out to me that I would like to recap and share with the audience as key takeaways for negotiation processes as peace builders. What would be really important is to be creative, to engage in preparation, to challenge assumptions. And I see a very important role for peace builders in what you said, as making the parties see what the possibilities are. And I think that is a very important role that peace builders can play when they are negotiating with parties, to make them see what the possibilities are, because the parties already know and they are dealing with and experiencing all the differences and the challenges and the consequences of it. The importance of face saving and the psychological components that you mentioned, I feel are so critical, and which are not sufficiently understood or taken on board in negotiations. They are critical because ultimately it's human beings that are involved in the negotiations, in conflict resolution, and in peace processes. So we should never lose sight of those psychological elements, as you said. Taking the problem-solving approach and not always the advocacy-oriented approach is also a very important lesson I learned, because it is so much about the relationships. And as you said, negotiation is about exploring the relationships with the people. And also, what was very interesting and enlightening is that a negotiations isn't always about agreement. It's about achieving the interests and the goals and the objectives. And if you can do it together, it improves the relationship ultimately. The importance of terminology and language you mentioned, and how not only the words you use, but the underlying meaning that are attached to the words are equally important. You mentioned the importance of persistence, and I would also like to add to that by underlining the importance of patience in the process. And finally, of course, when it comes down to the negotiator themselves and peace builder, I would like to say and reiterate the point you made about the mindset, to have an agile mindset that is humble, to recognize that the process is indeed a process and it is a learning curve, even for the negotiator, even for the peace builder. And the importance of reflecting and doing a post-mortem after every process to see what could have been done better and what could have been done differently. So with that, I will conclude
today's webinar by giving a big round of thanks to Josh, our speaker today, on behalf of the Improving Practice Working Group of GPAC, and to my colleagues Lucy and Christina, who have been supporting the entire process, and to our wonderful audience here today, who have asked very interesting and important questions. So, Josh, thank you very much. And if you would like to make a closing remark finally to the peace building community here.
Sure, Selma. Thank you so much. It was really fun. I'm glad that folks got something from it. And you know, I would encourage you all, by the way, to share your stories. You know, I think it's important that the world understands the work that you're doing. It's tireless, it's difficult, it's thankless. But I think it's really important that one way to really share and to get the world to maybe see things a little bit differently and to change a bit is to share your stories. Everybody can relate to stories, they cut across cultures. And so I would encourage people to really put these out there. And, you know, and I think it helps to change people's minds about what effective negotiation looks like, you know, what dealing with difficult conflicts looks like. And I think one of the really, really important things is we have to create in the world the air of possibility that if we, you know, if certain conflicts have been solved or transformed or changed, whatever the language is that you want to use, those need to be out there for people to see and understand, so that when somebody says that'll never be done or that'll never be solved, you've got examples. And you can't argue with real world examples. That's one of the real lessons I've learned from this book, is it's very hard when it's happened to, you know, sort of push back against that. And so that would be my strong suggestion to all of you, is to think about how you can share the stories of your practice that I'm sure have made tremendous changes, but the problem is people don't know about them. And so we have to tell the world these stories, and we have to tell them very loud and very clearly, so that people will think to take these approaches and not necessarily use violence. So thank you all, and thanks for the amazing questions. It's always great to share this and have people understand the nuances of it the way you all did, and to think deeper about it. So it's been a real pleasure, and thank you, Selma, for having me, and Lucy for facilitating.
Thank you, Josh. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we're having lots of comments coming through the chat box. But there was one comment which said it's one of the best Zoom webinars that Elif has attended, and many have learned a lot from today, concrete, tangible lessons and techniques. So it's been wonderful. Thank you very much, Josh, for your time, for sharing your insights and expertise. Goodbye, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Stay well. Bye-bye.
Thank you again.
You're welcome.
Wonderful,
Bye-bye.
wonderful webinar.